Give it a second to start.
We'll see it on the screen.
You should do. Yeah, you're live now. You're saying live here. So
okay. Hi. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Standards Committee. Just to kick things off, then you've all got copies of the agenda. First item is apologies for absence, but just before we do that, we've got a new member, Mr. Peter Clark, Councillor Peter Clark. If we could just do an introduction around the room, please, from David. I know you know each other.
I'm Dave Evans. I'm a member of this committee. Been so for many years now.
Thank you. Annette.
I'm Annette Evans, the Customer Relations Manager.
Richard Stowe, independent member. Richard McGonigal, I'm independent as well. We've been here 3 years now. Yeah.
Ryan Williams-Flew, independent member, and only been here, this is my third meeting, so quite recent.
Peter Easy, independent member, third meeting.
Irene Cameron, Community Councillor.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Matt Phillips, Head of Law and Monitoring Officer.
Trevor Alder, the independent member.
Sheila Woodhouse, member for Growth of Board in Abergavenny.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Pete. Okay, apologies for absence there.
No apologies received, Chair.
Apologies, thank you. Declarations of interest. Okay, I assume that's as in when. Moving on to item number 3 on the agenda. Welcome to Annette. Thank you for coming along today. Public Services Ombudsman for Wales annual letter, etc. I think that's over to you on that one, isn't it?
Okay, well, the Public Services Ombudsman for Wales, he produces an annual letter for each authority, and he's produced ours from Monmouthshire, and he's asked all authorities to take the report to Cabinet and to go back to him by the 31st of October with any considerations or proposed actions regarding the contents of the report or of their letter. So there's the Ombudsman's letter, and then there's my annual report as well. So the Ombudsman's annual letter gives a summary of the complaints they've received and investigated. And they break it down into subject categories. For Monmouthshire, they received 20 inquiries, and we were the 4th lowest where complaints were received. So the letter tells you about the outcome of their inquiries, whether the complaint was made prematurely. That means whether the complainant has gone to the Ombudsman before they've come to the local authority for us to try and sort out the problem. They also tell you whether it's out of jurisdiction, and that means, if a properly made decision has been made, for example, a planning decision. And they tell you about the cases closed after the initial consideration, and that's usually where they are satisfied with the council's response to the complaint. So there were no complaints that the Ombudsman investigated about Monmouthshire County Council. They then go on to talk about the Code of Conduct complaints, and there was one which was closed after initial consideration. There were a high number of town and community council code of conduct complaints. However, the Ombudsman does not consider there's been a fall in standards. There was conflict between a particular community council. Indeed, the monitoring officer commended our monitoring officer, head of law, for the work that he did with the training session that he organised about code of conduct. And as a result of that, he's going to be referring this work to the rest of Wales as an example of good practice.
Well done, that.
So, the Ombudsman has got new powers coming out, and at the moment his his document is out for consultation, and the consultation ends at the end of September. And one of his new powers is that he can conduct his own initiative investigations if he feels that they are in the public interest. So that sort of gives you a flavour of the Ombudsman's letter. I don't know whether anyone has any questions about that one before we go on to the whole authority report.
Questions? Richard?
Yes, can you just confirm that the power to do own initiative investigations is only for services issues, i.e. it's investigating authorities, and that doesn't cover investigating members of authorities re code of conduct issues? So it's only on the services side, it's not on the member conduct side?
I would expect it to incorporate both.
Yes,
That's my understanding.
I think it will be both. If he feels it's in the public interest and he has enough evidence, information, he can carry out his own investigations.
You can carry on.
Okay then.
Thank you.
So then we go on to the whole authority complaints, compliments and comments report, and this is for 2018, April 2018 to March 2019. So this gives you a flavour of the sort of issues that that I've received over that period. We follow the Ombudsman's model. All authorities in Wales follow the Ombudsman's model for dealing with complaints. There's 2 stages to the complaints process. The first stage is where we try and find a resolution and try and sort it out as quickly as possible and within 10 working days. If people are not satisfied, they can go on to the formal stage where an officer from another part of the service is appointed to investigate the complaint, and then a report is usually prepared on the findings of that complaint. Like I say, we try and sort out as many complaints as possible at that first stage. If at the end of the second stage that they are not satisfied, that they can go on to the Ombudsman then, and then they will decide whether they will investigate or not. So for this period that we're talking about, 2018-19, there were 143 complaints that were made, 187 comments and 180 compliments. Now, with regard to comments, we deal with them the same way as we deal with complaints. It's just perhaps that people don't want to go through a formal process, but we do still send the complaint or the comment to the service being commented about and ask that they look into it and that they respond to the person. So there were 132 complaints that was dealt with at stage 1. So there were a lot of the complaints, we were able to deal with at that level. 5 of those requested their complaints be dealt with at the formal investigation. And then there were 9 complaints that went directly to stage 2. So they didn't want to go to stage 1. They just wanted it formally investigated. And that's their prerogative, because that's part of our complaints procedure. So the formal complaints, the majority were regarding planning. People can't complain about the decision that's been made, but they can complain about if they feel the process hasn't been carried out properly. There was a staffing matter that was formally complained about. There were issues of transport. There were issues regarding the Borough Theatre, home adaptation, and equal opportunities at a leisure centre. So they were the formal complaints. But the majority of those complaints were not upheld. 2 complainants then decided to take their complaints to the Ombudsman, but the Ombudsman didn't carry out a formal investigation. The complaints that I get the most complaints about are waste and street services, highways, passenger transport, planning or development management as it is referred to, and the community heads. But by far, waste and highways are where we get the majority of the complaints. You'll see in my report there, you know, things like the mist and non-collections, hedges, verges not being cut, pothole repairs, street lighting, lack of communication. They are all the sorts of issues that I have been dealing with. With regard to passenger transport, you know, buses being late, not arriving, people feeling that they've had a poor customer service. Planning is usually around enforcement issues, unhappy with the planning consent or the notice given. The community hubs, there are issues about noise issues in the community hubs, and people feeling that perhaps they weren't receiving the proper standard of service there. So they were the sort of complaints that were dealt with, where people have said they want to make a complaint, and therefore those complaints were registered with us. Then we had 187 comments, and again, they were mostly about waste and street services, highways, registrars featured in there. So, and again, as I said, generally around the same sort of issues. But then we also log compliments, and you know, it's pleasing that we had 180 compliments. So as much as we're having all those complaints, people are actually taking the time to get in touch to compliment us about the services that they received. With regard to building control and registrars, they actually send out a questionnaire after they've done some work, and therefore a lot of compliments were received about those two particular services because of the questionnaire that is sent out. So with regard, I've mentioned the response time scales. We've got 10 working days to deal with stage 1 complaints, and then for stage 2 there we have 20 working days to carry out the investigation. And then the report then goes to the head of service, so the relevant head of service. And then they have to consider the report's findings, any recommendations, and then write a letter to the complainant saying what they're going to do as a result of the report's findings. We also get requests for service. People might say that I want to make a complaint, but it may just be a request for service. It's the first time that they've actually reported the problem. So therefore we would record that request for service and then send it on to the appropriate department. We always try to learn from complaints, and after every formal investigation we always have an action plan, and in that action plan, you know, we list the recommendations that were made, send it to the relevant managers and ask that they get back to us with an update on what action they've taken as a result of that complaint. So that's a brief overview of the whole authority complaints, comments and compliments report. In it you will see the detail, you know, the sort of things that I've just mentioned that I've been dealing with over the year.
Thank you. Are there any questions, Brenda?
I can just make an observation. The complaints you get are from residents of Monmouthshire?
Yes.
And is there a particular form that residents can fill in as a complaints form, or is it a letter form?
No, they can complain to us in any way that they want to complain to us. They can ring over the phone, there's a form on the website, a feedback form, there's forms in the community hubs, so they can write a letter. However they want to complain, they can complain in any format that they wish.
And as a community person, do you find that the people who complain have tried to contact their community council first and then perhaps felt they had to take it to a higher level?
No, I can't say that I found that at all, that people just generally come to us with a complaint. They haven't said that they've tried to contact their community council.
Okay, thank you.
Any other complaint? Any other comments? Richard?
Yeah, just to say, I thought it was really good in the report, and you talked about the learning from the experience to see all those service improvements. You've actually clocked them, haven't you, in the comments? That was really interesting. And so using that as intelligence. I know that's something that the Ombudsman is keen on, all authorities doing that. And I wonder if you could say something about what is this new Complaint Standards Authority that's, I think it's been created by the Act, the 2019 Act, and what will it mean for you and the procedures here?
Well, the Ombudsman has told us up to now that they're going to have this Complaint Standards Authority, and what they're trying to do is sort of benchmark across Wales so that they get an idea. We're going to log complaints all, under certain headings, adult services, benefits, that sort of thing, so that they can measure across Wales and taking into account the population, etc., on how each authority is doing. And they will be asking, and they have already asked us for quarterly statistics on the complaints that we've received and under certain categories. So we have a meeting with the Ombudsman in October. So it'll be interesting to find out more from the Ombudsman then, because the consultation period will have closed, and we'll know more about this new Complaint Standards Authority.
And my feeling from when you and I attended the presentation by the Ombudsman on the new bill was that the Scottish Complaints Standards Authority was very much a kind of model that they were looking at to probably follow.
Yeah.
Thank you. I noticed that your social services complaints are logged separately. Does that mean a different department investigates them, or is it your department?
Yes, it's our department. Yes, that's a different process altogether. So I do a separate complaints report on social services complaints, but I deal with the social services complaints as well.
Okay.
And
how does it differ from all other complaints? Does it have a different staging process or different?
Yeah, these regulations is a statutory process that we have to follow. Where again, it's a two-stage process. Stage one, try and resolve within 10 working days, or it's actually 17 working days, 2 days to acknowledge, 10 days to investigate, and 5 days to respond. And then stage two is different because we have to have an external investigating officer. And if the complaint is about children's services, we have to have an independent person as well. So there's a cost element to the social services complaints if they go to the formal stage of the process. I take that report to the Children's Services, Children, Young People Committee, and to the Adult Select Committee.
Okay. I notice I'm just desperately searching for it. I can't find it. I think I've just seen 51 as the figure of formal complaints.
And not formal.
Not formal complaints.
That's the whole of
the whole complaint.
Yeah,
oh, here we are.
because-
Complaints received. I beg your pardon.
Yes.
So how many of those went to formal complaints to stage 2? Do you know?
I think it was about 14, but I haven't got the information in front of me at the moment.
The reason I'm asking is, kind of the split of work in your department. So this investigating social services complaints, if they're dealt with separately from all other council services, clearly takes more of your staff time.
Yes.
To investigate.
Yes. Well, what we do is I ask the relevant team manager in adult or children's services to look at the stage 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then if people are not satisfied, they want to go on to stage 2, I would then appoint an investigating officer and independent person.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
And that has cost implications for the authority, clearly.
Yes, but we can't get out of that because, as I said, it's a statutory process where it says that external investigating officers must be appointed.
Is there a reason why we don't know more about the breakdown of social services complaints? Because it is part of the complaints remit, but could I ask the chair why we don't know more about it?
It's never really been pushed in that direction. It's always, in fact, your presentation to this committee is only a relatively recent event.
Yes.
So is that something we could do in the future?
It's probably worth just, I mean, given that the focus of the committee is the code of conduct element rather than the actual complaints process. So in that giving the kind of, this is a report that takes to cabinet and to audit committee already. So there's a detail on the organisational complaint side of things, which is probably beyond the remit of standards committee.
Fine, that's why I just wanted to clarify. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Richard, could I just ask, I sort of whizzed forward to the Ombudsman's letter to Councillor Fox, the annual letter. One of the paragraphs, he says, "You will note that we received a relatively high number of complaints this year relating to members of community and town councils in the council's area. However, please be assured that I do not consider this is indicative of a fall in standards of conduct generally, or indeed in the council itself. I can advise that the majority of these complaints related to an individual community council and a position of conflict between its members. That it seemed an incredibly high number of complaints from that particular council. Has that situation been resolved? Is it likely to get better?
I think Matt, because I don't deal with code of conduct, Matt can reply better than me.
It's got better, and I expect it to stay better. But there's probably some detail there that I'll cover later on the agenda, just to explain that specific one.
Okay, thank you. It's Richard, sorry.
Just to go back to this letter, is it, if you had to simplify all that work and say what's the big measure of success, is it this number, the fact that there were no complaints with PSW intervention, and look at the interventions across the other authorities, shows that Monmouthshire is in a good state? Is that fair to say?
It is, yes, definitely.
I think that's brilliant, because there's only Merthyr Tydfil, isn't there, and Monmouthshire on 0, and look at the rest.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
So I think that's a really good result.
Okay. Any further questions for Annette?
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed for the report.
Thank you.
Are we live streaming? Can we have that on? So
I thought it was
screen there.
I'm not actually sure. I could go and check upstairs with one of my colleagues, but it is live.
Okay.
Would you like me to check that, Chair?
Richard, is it?
Something happening in the bottom right hand corner.
Yeah,
I think it is on.
Yeah.
it is, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Slide
our ties a bit. Okay. If we move on to item number 4, then recent adjudication panel for Wales outcome, which is humour.
If you're trying to get onto YouTube to see if we're on there.
Oh.
Right. So this is the outcome from an ongoing public services investigation and then adjudication panel of Wales hearing that we mentioned in the last meeting, and in between those two meetings there's been a result. And whilst I sent an email out with the decision, I think it's worth covering here as well. I will take you very quickly just through a chronology, just for anyone that's watching as well. So this relates to Councillor Graham Down, who was formerly a county councillor here and is currently a community councillor at Mathen. And I'm going to take you all the way back to February 2016, where there was an exchange of emails between him and the chief exec here, and then some subsequent emails in October 2016, which resulted in a complaint to the Public Services Ombudsman relating to what was felt at the time the homophobic nature of the content of those emails. The Ombudsman decided to investigate. The first stage of that investigation then completed in July 2017, followed by an interview of Councillor Down, and the Ombudsman decided to refer the matter to the Adjudication Panel for Wales for consideration. The three options being take no further action, refer it back to the Standards Committee, or onto the Adjudication Panel. And that was the decision they took. That hearing then took place in summer of 2018. So you can see I've done the chronology just to kind of map out the timescale here. And then on the 19th of July last year, at the completion of that hearing, the Adjudication Panel of Wales found against Councillor Down in that matter. But then resulting from the completion of that hearing, actually in the tribunal itself, and then in a subsequent letter a week later, there was another allegation that Councillor Down had used kind of ostensibly homophobic language, both orally in the tribunal, and then following it up with a letter to the Adjudication Panel a week later. A month later, then I think that letter was then also sent on. I'm not entirely sure by who. It may well have been Councillor Down himself, but I'm not entirely sure of that, to the Public Services Ombudsman. And so as a result, the Ombudsman took the decision to investigate whether Councillor Down had breached the Code of Conduct again for the use of that language. That investigation completed and was referred to the Adjudication Panel for Wales once again. And then in March of this year, Richard Stowe and I went along to the Adjudication Panel hearing, which was held in Cwmbran Magistrates. At that point, Councillor Down's submissions was that there had effectively been no complaint made to the Ombudsman around the matter, that the Ombudsman had decided to investigate the matter of his own volition. And there was a few other points raised as well, but that was probably the principal one. Meant that it wasn't actually a fully formed complaint, and that the Ombudsman didn't have jurisdiction to deal with the matter. The Adjudication Panel adjourned from that hearing, requesting further legal argument from both the Ombudsman and then in response from Councillor Down, addressing the point as the points that he'd raised, that being the principal one. And then the matter was effectively dealt with on the papers, as we'd call it. So rather than returning to hold another hearing, it was agreed between the two parties that they could, the Adjudication Panel could come to a conclusion on the legal submission that was provided to them. And their decision was, and this is the letter that's available on the website, that the case was to be discontinued because fundamentally they found that no complaint had been made to the Ombudsman, which would have then triggered their ability to investigate the matter. So it's quite a convoluted series of events there, but ultimately it was that whilst any number of people heard during the course of the tribunal some of the language used, and then the letter was sent not just to the Adjudication Panel but to the Ombudsman, there wasn't actually a person who came forward and made a complaint about it. The Ombudsman treated it as a kind of ongoing matter from the previous complaint, which had originated here from Chief Exec. But the Adjudication Panel found that was inappropriate because it was a discrete matter and therefore required a complaint. And that's effectively where we find ourselves. My view, for what it's worth, from having attended the hearing, is I think the Adjudication Panel have acted correctly here. Putting aside whatever view I might have on the language used, the process and the law as it's written did require a complaint to be made. And I think to treat what's discussed in one tribunal matter to then act as an extension of that matter would probably be a step too far, which is what the Adjudication Panel themselves found. And I suppose probably one of the most interesting things to fall out of this is when you look at the new Public Services Ombudsman Act that Annette just raised. Of course, it does now provide the Ombudsman with the power to instigate investigations of their own volition, so it wouldn't require a complaint. And just in the last 5 minutes, I've been looking through the Act because of Richard's question about whether it will apply to code of conduct. I'll pull up the kind of criteria that we got. Annette and I got this from when we attended the briefing the Ombudsman did. The criteria for own initiative investigations, one of public interest, reasonable suspicion of systemic maladministration that may cause injustice or hardship, the impact on citizens who may be vulnerable or disadvantaged, weight of the evidence, and then how persuasive is the evidence. Those are the key kind of criteria that they go through as to whether they're going to conduct their own initiative investigation. But it is possible to read that and interpret that the growth in powers are certainly more aimed at the health sector, but there's also talk of systemic maladministration and injustice and hardship. So again, from Annette's part of the world, complaints that deal with systemic failings from the organisation. But actually you could read that as making it quite difficult for the Ombudsman to instigate an own initiative investigation on a code of conduct matter, because it doesn't really relate to it. And having just very quickly gone through the legislation as well, it doesn't read any different to that. Having said that, there is absolutely nothing has come across in the literature, or it's certainly the day that we spent with the Ombudsman and his team, which suggested that code of conduct matters wouldn't be a potential target of one of these own initiative investigations. But it is something that it's probably worth me going back and clarifying. My feeling would be they're likely to say no, it will be. They will be able to use these powers to investigate code of conduct matters, even though I don't think it reads that way. I think the chances are it would be a fairly unusual case if they were to do that, just because of how it's written, and because they are still constrained. They were predicting 2 to 3 uses a year of this new power, so it wasn't going to be a big kind of watershed moment necessarily, because they're constrained by resource. But that's my, I suppose, narrative and comment on the APW decision.
So just following on that then, could you possibly write to the Ombudsman and ask him for clarification and say, do the new powers, was it the intention, or does he believe, given the ability to do own initiative investigations into members of authorities with code of conduct issues? Because it's certainly not clear, and it wasn't clear from, I think you'd sent me some slides, or I saw some slides on the new powers as well, and I read through there, and the language and the criteria all make sense if you're thinking about service failures within an authority, health authority, social care, whatever. And it looked like, when it's serious things are going on, we should be able to go after them, fix them, and learn from them. But it really felt like the language is all authorities and service failures. It didn't feel the right language for members and conduct. But it would be interesting to know, because of how this case, this APW things, might have mapped out differently.
Yeah.
You see where I'm?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really not clear. And I did read. I read the Act, and I read the section of the Act, and then I went back to the presentations they've been using to explain it to people. It wasn't clear. Is it just services, or is it and code of conduct? But the language is all very service failure oriented. And
I imagine that's a manifestation of the fact that 85% plus of his work involves health boards, and then of the remaining factor, actually the majority is more that systemic complaints thing that sits in the next area rather than code of conduct. But no, it absolutely needs clarifying, and I'd take that as an action.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, just on the decision again, it was interesting at the end, because they basically threw this out on the basis of the Ombudsman had gone beyond the powers in section 69 of the Local Government Act. They didn't address, what was an interesting issue for me was the thing raised by Councillor Down about immunity, i.e. participants in court proceedings have the benefit of immunity. And this particularly would relate to his comments that he made at the end of the previous hearing after the decision was announced. So that was part one. And so it's a question for you, Matt, really. Is that correct? Would you expect the comments that Councillor Down made in July 2018 at the hearing after the panel announced their decision, would you expect they would benefit from immunity, and therefore they should never have been part of this second hearing? And that question is the point that he made, and the panel decision this time says in the end of the thing, so we didn't consider the issue of immunity because we've already ruled it out. So
yeah, convenient for them and less so for me. I noted that paragraph in the letter. I'm trying to find it. Now. I don't know. I mean,
it's the last paragraph in the decision. It's paragraph 31. It just says, in the light of the case tribunal's decision to dismiss the case, it is not necessary to examine the respective submissions on core immunity.
Yeah.
And
they did cite it earlier on in it as well.
Yeah.
And they've I suppose understandably they focused on the core element. For me, I think had this been a court, then you would have had a wider judgment, because that would have been an important legal point. Yeah. There's so little APW case law, for want of a better phrase, that it would have helped to advance it. I'm not going to be able to give you a sensible answer, because I would look to see how the APW has dealt with the matter. If it ever came up, it's come up. It didn't deal with the matter. So I don't know.
Thank you for raising that, Richard. It's just an observation from me that having now, I don't have a legal background, but looking at all the arguments in this particular case, and then looking back at the other ones that we've dealt with over the years, the Calver and the Heason ones, is in terms of the role of the Standards Committee, it seems to be frustrated at every attempt to sort of take things forward by all these legal cases that are making it more difficult for action to be taken against councillors, because they fall back on things that we're perhaps unaware of as their primary source of defence as to how they're acting. Whereas I think from a standards side of things, there's a sort of a decency that we expect people in public life to uphold. When they don't, they seem to be able to wriggle out of it by these various legal means. I don't know if anyone else gets that impression from it. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, will it ever be possible to challenge the Calver decision? Because I know it stands, but in some instances, it just doesn't make sense that people are expected to have such thick skin, they can take anything on board, whereas the person receiving the insults should have the opportunity to say, this is not acceptable.
I'm just trying to remind myself whether Calver went to the High Court. Yes, it did. So yes, it can be challenged because we have.
They believe that they've been insulted.
Well, but the element of the Calver ruling which is relevant here is the thick skin part, and so that is the precedent as it stands. But the way our legal system works is that can be superseded by a superior court should a case ever get to that level again. But I think the number of cases that are likely to contain an element like that, and then for it to escalate to higher than the High Court, I think it's probably here to stay for a while before we get to a point where that would happen and a court was to find against.
It just seems to be boiling and bubbling up everywhere, particularly in Parliament at the moment.
We haven't mentioned prorogation, have we?
I'll stay clear of that.
On your point, Trevor, as a committee member, I feel about this whole kind of Councillor Down situation, I feel sort of relatively impotent as a committee member, because I feel like we're sort of sitting here on the inside watching all this stuff going on around us, and we can't sort of reach out and touch it and do anything about it and influence it. And I think it's unfortunate that there's been this sort of enterprise of the adjudication panel that's then found procedurally it can't do anything more And I think all that's happened in that process is that the gentleman in question has just been given a platform to kind of repeat the stuff that he wants to say. And I feel quite sort of aggrieved about that, because I just want to sort of stop giving this chap a platform. And I think back to the decision in summer 2018, I think he was suspended for 3 months, was that right? 2 months in the summer period, which again felt sort of relatively ineffectual and sort of limited amount of impact. And I feel like the gentleman in question is actually sort of making a bit of a mockery of the system slightly. And I feel like there's not an awful lot we can do about it. And I feel quite innocent.
And things like Article 10 of the European Human Rights is that, you know, suddenly you're confronted with this. I don't know the full implications of it, but it seems to stop us dead in our tracks if we wanted to pursue something.
Well, I mean, this has failed on a procedural point. I suppose the intention of the original act, accepting that because it's now been updated, is that you don't give power to a body to look into something apropos of, I say no outrage, but the fact in this case was no one actually complained. So I don't think there's impotence within the system to deal with this stuff. It just requires someone to have made the complaint in the first place. Now, they may have stymied that, of course, by taking the action to investigate, and therefore no one necessarily felt the need to complain. So there's an argument there.
But that whole procedural thing that's happened over the last year, that is what it is, and it's done and it's dusted. But if you just go back to the decision that was made last summer, you know, that was the bit that had the teeth. That was the bit where there was an opportunity to do something meaningful about it. And it doesn't feel like that really happened, but that was taken out of our hands anyway as a group of people who are here to try and enforce standards within Monmouthshire. And you know, the gentleman in question is still in public office somewhere, although I believe he's in a different role to what he was doing. He's no longer a councillor, is he? He's now a community.
Yeah.
Is that a totally different position? Is that remunerated? Is that voluntary? It's voluntary position. So he's in a different role, but still there. So I assume he's still subject to the code of conduct.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Richard. Are there any further comments on this? Okay, thank you for the report, Matt. If we move on to the item number 5 on the agenda, which is the Clerks' Conference feedback and discussion. So, Mark, thank you very much. You made a very comprehensive series of notes on that, which would be useful with links you sent out earlier on. I attended that, and I think Peter and Irene, you attended as well, didn't you? Irene, do you have anything to say?
I spoke to lots of people there, and particularly I felt that the clerks to the committees found it very worthwhile, particularly listening to the law and advice given to committees and the role that they have to play. And I really do feel we should empower the clerks to feel very confident when they're giving advice to committees as to what they should do when something goes wrong. And certainly everyone that I spoke to were all saying how much they appreciated the opportunity to be made aware of what was available and to be able to talk to each other. And some of them said we should do it more often. You know, it was a very worthwhile experience.
Yeah. Peter, do you have any?
I mean, I don't think we should let the moment pass to thank Matt, since the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales has quoted the conference as an example of national good practice. So
yeah, excellent.
To thank him and to record that. It was a very, very useful session. I could, as you said, tell from the people around that they were learning a lot and were enjoying it. So it would be wonderful if it could be repeated more often. But I also got the feeling of how much work had to go into it to create that platform, that opportunity. Perhaps something a little bit less large, a little bit less complex, but just some device to allow the clerks particularly to be in contact with each other and to be in contact with Matt.
That's excellent. I made a few notes, which was really just sort of talking to the various clerks. And one of the things I didn't appreciate was the level of bullying and intimidation that they get. They were quite concerned about that. And I felt again a bit impotent in terms of what can we as a committee do to protect them. And if they raise complaints, and you mentioned earlier on about complaints in one particular council, but how can they be addressed? What could we do to help them? The things like varying rates of remuneration, some were complaining about that. Somebody got more than others. Training that the clerks receive, I wasn't clear on whether that was a coordinated training or whether each particular council had to do its own thing. Do you know that?
Well, I think that was one of the more interesting things I learned during the day was the differing levels of awareness between the clerks as to what training was available out there. So it's not it's not coordinated centrally here because that's not how the relationship exists. But I think one of the really useful things was having One Voice Wales, and then the reference to some of the clerks talking about the online training they've done with the SLCC, and then the longer piece of training. I think, one of the key aims of the day was to have them kind of learn off each other, and I think that was one of the really useful things. Was you'd have someone say there's no training on something, and then someone else go, well, I've done the online course. Someone else, well, I didn't know there was an online course, and it was to NALC and the books and stuff. So no, I don't think it's coordinated. I think it is left to individual councils, but there's a fair bit out there.
Can I just come in again and say that I think it built on the training that we had undertaken anyway, our day's training. So perhaps we felt more confident. And certainly we've talked about raising awareness of standards. Now, if I can just take this opportunity to say, when I was on the General Teaching Council for Wales, every teacher had this little booklet. I've given some to the chair. And I think that the county councillors, it would be a very good thing for them to have, and community councillors, so that standards of behaviour we want to see high, and I think it would be a very good awareness raising thing to do.
Can I ask Matt how many councils did not attend that day?
How many councils
were represented?
It was just over a quarter, I think.
If you did it again, you really need to encourage the ones that weren't there to attend, because where the problems will occur in the future are in the councils which do not go to these courses. It happens in planning, as you know. I'm sure it happened.
The attendance was better than I'd hoped, to be perfectly honest. And I did a lot of encouraging, yes. Of the councils that I'm aware have had, say, greater problems than others, I think they were all there, which was encouraging. So I didn't get that sinking feeling that any particular kind of problem areas weren't represented. So yeah, that was one of the positives actually. But if we look to do this again at some point, hopefully, I think the fact that it was quite well received by the other clerks will then reinforce attendance by others as well.
Especially if we tell them how many did attend, perhaps it would make them realise they missed an opportunity.
I'm wondering if I did. Sounds like the kind of cheeky thing I would do.
It was a good letter. The summary that you sent out was very good.
It was, yeah. I just add to the comments I made. The other things that I was sort of made aware of was in terms of communicating with the community, it was left to the clerks and to the various councils themselves to work out whether they needed a website of their own, and how that was structured and what they put on it. It appears that there's no guidance on that, and some do it better than others. The other couple of things, recording of meetings in one particular town council. They record all their meetings, and they went to the trouble of getting a code to enable them to use it, so that at times, like we're doing today, switch it off when there's something that crops up. But I think I thought it was quite a good idea that, particularly if we get any referrals here through code of conduct issues, that we could always say, well, can we have a copy of your recording? But again, it's left entirely to the councils themselves to work out whether they're going to do that or not. And the other thing that I asked, I think at the last meeting we were talking about dispensations, and one of the things I think, Peter, you mentioned it, is that when a council is seeking a dispensation, they could go to the clerk and get some guidance on it. So I asked the clerks what they knew about dispensations and whether they could provide that guidance, and they weren't very confident about it. They felt that the actual items that go towards a dispensation, they didn't fully understand them, and therefore, because of that, they felt that they couldn't, with confidence, give guidance to councillors. So that's something I know we can come on to again. So that was my observations.
There's a couple of things to pick up then. I mean, that links to Irene's point on the empowerment of the clerks. So just to kind of explain how things generally pan out is I'll often be approached by a councillor in the first instance if there is some matter. It might be a code of conduct matter, it might be something a little bit more constitutional, something about the standing orders, how should a meeting run. The first step is always to push them to the clerk, because that's got to be their first point of contact. Now, it's not trying to slope shoulders onto them, but it's about then having the clerk involved in the conversation as the middleman between the council and me as much as possible. And then if it's something that clerk isn't particularly confident on, I would prefer to have the conversation with them, because you get the developmental kind of experience element of that, which would then position them better to deal with stuff in the future. And if I do have a direct approach, and I've gone back and said, go to your clerk first, but someone still wants to kind of engage directly with me, I'll still involve the clerk in whatever the reply is that I go back to, if it's dealing with something by email or what have you. So that goes to the dispensation point as well. Yeah, in terms of doing it again, certainly, I'm not sure I'd make it. I don't know, I'm going to sit here and define how often I do it. Someone made the point about making it, I think Peter said, less complex rather than, I might, taking into account what Irene said about the training that we did and the fact that there was the chance to interact with 2 other local authorities, actually I can kind of see an iteration of this, probably looking to combine with maybe a couple of our neighbouring authorities at the clerks level, and involving standards committees and seeing if there's something to be gained by doing that. It's a very, very raw idea at the moment, but there might be some benefit in greater complexity actually. But I'm not going to commit myself to any particular timescale on delivering that. Protecting clerks, it's very difficult because, and it's the same, remuneration was mentioned, and quite frankly, I'm just not going to go there, because this constant friction that we have is any hierarchical relationship between county council and town and community councils really only comes through this committee and me when it comes to code of conduct. Everything else is entirely a sovereign matter for town and community councils. So I think the protection of clerks and elements pertaining to that, it goes to the empowerment point. It's about making them as well equipped to deal with matters that could potentially come here as possible, and taking a few steps beyond to try and help out on non-code of conduct matters. But also, I think the key thing about that day was they now have the network to lean on, and I know that has worked since as well from conversations I've had.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Can I just ask a question on the complaints from clerks about bullying? Because bullying is a very serious event for any of us. But if you're, trying to manage a group of individuals in a local community, you live in that community, you are trying to uphold the standards of a committee that is meant to be looking after the good of the community, and the clerk is experiencing bullying from individual community members, where do they go with those complaints? I mean, where do they have natural recourse to redress?
Well, the same as anyone else is the ombudsman to put in a complaint via that route. And I was going to say typically, but I can't say typically because I don't know those that don't come to me. But usually, from my experience, if something escalates to the ombudsman, it's because they've come to me first. And so we might have tried certain ways of dealing with it. But if that's just not dealing with the matter, then the ombudsman. Been here a year. There's probably 2 or 3 complaints gone to the ombudsman, maybe, which either they're less likely to cite specific bullying. It's more likely to be articulated through some sort of maladministration by a councillor doing something they shouldn't be doing, and then the attempts by the officers, clerk, deputy clerk, whoever it might be, to intervene, not working and feeling kind of pressurised and sidelined from what their proper role should be. So it's usually articulated in that kind of way. But of those complaints that have gone to the ombudsman, none have been, certainly none have reached a point of sanction. I couldn't remember off the top of my head if they were investigated or not. But it's a fairly high bar that the ombudsman sets, just because you need that evidential basis for them to work on. Otherwise, it becomes one person's word against another, and it's impossible to investigate really.
That one council, there's 23, I
Yes.
think it was, complaints. That indicates that there's something drastically wrong there, doesn't it? Really.
Yes.
And in terms of what's being done about it, what action has been taken?
I'm going to come on to that in the next bit, just because, again, I'm conscious of how we best empower and look after our clerks and what have you, and there's levels of detail that I think that's the purpose of the exemption request later on.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, are there any further comments on that? Yeah. Okay, if we can go on to item number 6 on the agenda then, which is guidance on assessing council meetings, and I thank Rhiannon on this. She kindly offered to provide this guidance.
I'm not sure I agree to guidance. I agree to I agreed to open discussions on the matter.
Okay.
I do recall Matt raising, I think at the meeting before last, about how best we as a committee could, if you like, observe how councils function, whether they be community councils or county councils or local council. How best we could, observe how they function and what's good practice and what, kind of are there areas of learning that they could benefit from. And I was speaking to Matt outside the meeting that in a previous role, when I worked for the Committee for Administrative Justice in Wales, which had oversight of all devolved tribunals in Wales to see how they delivered administrative justice. So rights of redress, so complainants appeal to a tribunal for whatever reasons, whether it's benefits or health or whatever. And there are procedures in which those tribunals have to function, I'm sure not dissimilar to how councils have to function, and laws that they have to navigate and abide by. And of course, they all do it in their own individual, for want of a better way of describing it, silos. They just function in their tribunal forum. And the Council for Administrative Justice was an overview. So we had oversight of all those tribunals, all those rights of redress for the public to challenge how things were done to them or delivered to them. And it was fascinating, although you were looking across the piece of from benefits right through to, in fact, adjudication panels. We used to observe those as well. You're looking across, and of course, laws are different in each jurisdiction, but the fundamental principles of, are the tribunals functioning as they should do in terms of known principles and principles of ombudsman's codes of conduct, etc., run through all of them, same as they would in a community council or a council here. And it was interesting because each time we had the authority to visit. It was empowered by the First Minister, so very different from this scenario. But so we had the right to visit. But it wasn't an inspection role as such. It wasn't a kind of, you've done this right or you've done that wrong and you need to improve. It was more of a kind of, observational visit, and a formal report was given, which was advisory, but it was a dialogue between the overseeing body and the individual tribunal chairs or the individual tribunals. And what it did was to highlight, and there was a yearly report, of course, by the overseeing body about where areas of good practice were being, highlighted, and where areas of improvement. And it was not dissimilar, I'm sure, to the reports Annette collates, where there's points of learning, and it's important because if you're operating in like a community council, a small community council, it's not until you kind of hear about how someone else functions or see, talk to a clerk and hear how they function that you realise that perhaps I've missed a trick. Maybe I haven't read the situation correctly. So our role was very much about kind of trying to improve best practice across the piece, if you like. Whether we were successful or not is that for someone else to decide, but certainly the experiences of the people who appealed, we would also ask them as well about their experience of what happened to them on that day, if we were happened to be observing the tribunal. And that was interesting as well, because that helped to give feedback to the tribunal and the chairs of the tribunal about what was good, what they found reassuring, or maybe what they found not so reassuring or intimidating. And it's about that kind of experience of, it's not about inspecting a body, it's about observing a body and seeing how they function and what is relevant to the laws they're operating in, the practices, the code of practice they're operating in, and encouraging them either to develop that or improve it, or think about how they're functioning, why they're there, because sometimes you lose sight of why you're doing something, because you might have been doing it for years, or I've always done it this way, or whatever people have experiences of. I mean, the difference there is the interface was about complainants. People were appealing to a tribunal, so there is an appellant in the case, so that's slightly different from community councils, but it kind of gives you, if you have to have guidance about why you're observing, what's the purpose of your observation, and what's in it for the person you're observing, if you like, or the body you're observing, because they have to buy into it. They have to understand why you're doing it. They have to understand the benefits that they could gain from it. And it gives important feedback to a committee like this, or the council that I sat on previously. It gives you feedback of, well, what's it like for that service to be delivering the service they're supposed to be delivering. And just thinking about Matt's comments about, well, what do we know as a standards committee about how our community councils function or our councils function, and do they comply with the code of conduct? And well, we hope they do, we trust they do, but do they? It's interesting to hear comments from the training day that, you know, Clark's feeling bullied. Well, that immediately tells me that, you know, well, are all those councillors, you know, reflective of the code of conduct? Are they actually aware of it at all times, which they should be? So it's about, I mean, opening up a wider discussion, if you like. If we want to know, not need to know, if we want to know how our councils are functioning, so that if something comes here, we have a view, a broader view of how they're, you know, what's happening out there. Because to be perfectly honest, I don't know if anyone else in this room, I mean, Irene might do because she sits on a community council, but I have no notion of, you know, how they function. I know in principle, and I know I can read the minutes of my local community council. I could probably attend, but you know, it's how they. It's best practice, really. I mean, are they all functioning at best practice? A quarter of them turned up to the training meet. Well, that's fabulous. But what about the other 3/4? Councillors raised that. You know, they could be continuing to be blissfully ignorant that they're not complying with the code. They're not delivering the best that they could do for their communities. And you know, if they do deliver good practice and then complaints drop, customers are happy, residents are happy. So it's about that, really. But you have to not see it as inspection, but as observation, and that's the buy-in. That it's about, well, our observations are you do this well, you're complying with the code, and that's where the guidance for us would have to come in. Well, what are we observing? What are we wanting to see as good practice? And I think that's for us as a committee, if you choose to go down that road, to decide upon. I mean, you know, the obvious thing is to look at the principles of the code of practice, and you know, do councils operate in that framework? And where are the examples of that? And you have to have some record of that, because obviously you have to be as objective as possible when you're doing your observation, and it would, you know, you have to write in a fair and balanced way yourselves about the observations you're giving. You share those observations. We always shared the observations at the end of the visit directly with the panel that we had observed, so that there were no surprises. I mean, it has to be fair and open and, you know, transparent. They knew there would be a short written report, nothing terribly formal, but, you know, just the observations of what was good and what probably needed some improvement. Also looked at what training they had, which is another indication of, you know, if people have had good training, usually their practice was good. If their training had been missed or, you know, absent, there were often more areas of improvement required. So, you know, there's a definite correlation between the two. But it was very, very helpful as us as a body overseeing the whole of tribunals in Wales, because we had to report to the First Minister on how actions of redress for citizens were functioning. The same, I mean, I don't see that as being any different here. You know, our standards committee could be looking at, well, how are our councils functioning, particularly our community councils, which I think Matt has, you know, raised as an issue previously, because they do act on their own. They're out there doing the very, very best they do, but maybe sometimes their very best isn't the best. And, you know, observing that could be helpful. So just I have experience of that. I know it can work, but it has to be dealt with in a way that, you have the buy-in of the people who are having you visit as an observer. But it's very clear it has to be an observation, not an inspection, because that has different connotations altogether.
Difficult to divorce the two, though, isn't it?
Well, it is actually, if you have the right mindset about it and you have, guidelines for the people who are doing the observations. And obviously you have to encourage that will be the process, that, expectations that will happen. But it might help us as a committee to understand, where things are, and then allow Matt to be much more aware of where areas of concern may be, or maybe more targeted training if he's up for doing training a little more often. The kind of highlighting that actually there is a core of community councils that areas of improvement are needed more than others, and maybe Matt may consider that they need more guidance.
Okay, thank you for that. If I could just ask the councillors present then, how do you receive that comments? How would you like someone observing your council meetings?
Well, I sit on one and I go to 3 others. I go to 4 community council meetings this month, and the variance in them is phenomenal. Some are over in an hour, some are 3-hour meetings. Some go into total depth on subjects, others the subjects are not even touched. And I really do wonder at times as whether the communication that goes out to them is received by them all, and whether the clerks are sifting it before they put it before us. I don't know, but my observation, I've been doing it for 30 years now, is that the variety on community councils is phenomenal.
Absolutely. I mean, I sat on any town council, and we had a very, very good clerk. So the information we were given about training, for example, I mean, training is so important. It's been mentioned several times here this morning. That is the key. And we were all made aware of what the statutory training was, the code of conduct, and then what was available. And we were issued with that information several times a year. But it's all about knowing where to find this information. You referred to dispensations. Unless a clerk needs to know that information because it's needed at that time, they're not going to sort of be sending it out to everybody. So it's about finding out what's needed and where it is, to be honest. So training and where you can find information, that's 2 of the most important things. As Peter said, all the councils are different formats, different numbers, deal with things differently. But the chair or the mayor takes a lot of responsibility for ensuring that members are kept up to date with things, as well as the clerk. I think that's the important role too, that needs to be, they need to work together. All the clerks are different and they do it in different ways, some part-time, some full-time. So yes, it does vary, but I do think it comes down to knowing where the information is and training, and the resources we've got and our responsibilities with regard to how much we can actually put out there, if it's possible. And looking at Matt, because obviously you've taken a big step organising this conference. It's been well received. If we had the time and resources to do that on a regular basis, it would be great. But it works both ways. You need people to want to come to it, and we need to have resources to do it. So if we can find a way of providing information to town and community councils that works, maybe we need to go out there and ask them. I mean, you've already done that with your conference, I appreciate. But we, as Peter said, there is information we simply don't always get, because the clerk has to decide what is relevant for that particular council. So yes, it would be lovely to sort of have a good overview of how many community councils have we got? 33
or 34, it's one of the 2.
Yeah. And they all work in different ways.
I agree with what's been said, but I chair the CALCON, and what worries me is when councillors come to that meeting, you can see they haven't even opened the envelope which all the information had been sent out. And in fairness to our clerks, and our relay this, they thought the day was excellent. They would like to know when you're going to do the next one, because they thought they learned a lot. But if, going back to what was being said about bullying, in the county court, if our clerks, because we've got a clerk and a deputy and we've got an administration person, if any of them feel that they're under pressure from a councillor or a member of the public, what they'll do, they'll come and say, at the moment, this is happening, that's happening, and then they'll ask, can it go on the personnel agenda? And we'll look at it at that level, and if we feel that it needs to go further, that's what we will recommend, and that will go to the town council, full town council, for them to agree it. But overall, my concerns are that some of them are just on it, and some of them didn't realise what was involved, the time was involved, and the length of meetings. And it does worry me because at the end of the day, they've been elected on there and they're representing the community. And if they haven't got the community at that, they should get stepped down and let somebody else come on.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Jack Summer. Just I've been on the community council for 25 years, and we've had good clerks and we've had not such good clerks. We've had good chairs and not so good chairs. At the moment, I'm sure Peter will agree with me because we're on the same committee. We have first class clerk, first class chair, and it all goes really well. And it's been that way. The standard is set. So whoever takes over, we would expect the same standard. But it comes back to standards again, doesn't it? If standards drop, other things drop. And I would certainly recommend this little a booklet like this to remind people, not only should there be standards, we should expect high standards. And if they fall, something's got to be done about it. And this committee is the standards committee.
If we did do observational visits of the 33, I think you just said that, community councils, it would be perfectly feasible for that to be collated into a, observational report to be distributed to all 33. I mean, this committee's observations of what is good, bad or indifferent about how those 33 councils function, then they'd all be seeing it at the same time. They'd all be seeing where areas of good practice, where areas of improvement, where availability of training. You could signpost people, and it's all about signposting mostly these days, isn't it? Where you need to go here, you need to go there. Endlessly happens when you try and communicate with a public body. You get signposted through various gateways before you can get somewhere. I mean, this committee could do that if it had that scheme of operation, which would then allow wider discussion between those councils.
I think Matt and I have exchanged emails on the issue of mission creep, which is we have a set sort of number of items that we look at that would take us into a different area which we've never been into if we were to embark upon that. Resources, time and money. Again, I don't know. Do you have any views on that?
Just to explain the mission creep context, I'm reviewing the constitution at the moment, which is taking up every spare minute I have. So I've had to go through all of the terms of reference for every committee and then into delegated powers and quite a lot of looking at where reports are taken, because we have lots of reports taken to multiple bodies and stuff like that. So there's overlaps between committees that I'm just grappling with at the moment, shall we say. I mean, this is something that I've mentioned a few times since being here, because I like the idea. I mean, so I mean, Rhian, you said that I'd raised community councils as an issue. I'm going to tweak that slightly to, we have an incredibly well-behaved county council here. And so, by contrast, the vast majority of my work comes from interacting with town and community councils. That's not to say, actually, that they're bad at all in terms of the exposure I have to them. But of course, that recognises that I don't get exposed to everything that's going on in all of them. And I think if there's, I've spoken before about the reactive standards committee, which will wait for a matter to come from the ombudsman to then deal with, and then there's the ability to be more proactive. I know Cardiff, their select standards committee members do go out to their community councils, but there are 7 community councils in Cardiff, so it's a very different, and covering sizable areas and population because of it, so it's a different scale. But I definitely think there's a place for this kind of interaction. It's the one place I think the committee really can be proactive. How the detail of it works in terms of resourcing and what have you, I don't know, because I've been leaning more into the democratic services in terms of where budget lies for people going to do this, and then whatever that framework might be, I don't know. A line that I used when I was having a punt at getting a job in this place was, first you understand, then you can be understood. And I think there's probably a fair bit of mileage in just going and interacting with those community councils, just with the stated aim of understanding what they do before you even get to the next stage, which is sharing that experience across all of them. It's probably certainly the way to engage them in terms of, because you're talking about having kind of statutory backing to go and attend those tribunals. Of course, this would be on a far more friendly level, I suppose. Yes. So maybe just if the initial step is taken in terms of just going out with the view to just understanding the differences between a town council with 15,000 people or whatever it represents, and the very, very small community council where it's got constituents barely into the hundreds. So that might be a way of just engaging and getting a good response from people who want the standards committee to come along. Before then, we need to get to before then formulating what the feedback would look like. So it's one to consider maybe if you want to go in on a kind of incremental basis and just go out to understand in the first place. I think the benefit will ultimately come in that shared experience, but maybe just the understand piece to start with, because it will very, very legitimately inform how you conduct yourselves in the standards committee as and when you deal with dispensation requests and any discipline matters.
Okay, thank you. So should we leave it as a matter for you to talk to democratic services and just sort of see where we would go from there?
I'd be interested. I suppose I'm interested in the steer from the committees. Are you interested in just going out and engaging with and visiting town and community councils just on that, I suppose step one observational point?
I think you have to have the authority to go. I know there are open meetings and the public can go along, but I don't think we could just go along and say, I've come to observe you. I think that would be not received well.
No, and that's why I talk about doing it purely on the observational understand. I'm a member of a standards committee. I need to understand how you work. Would you mind if I come along? I think it needs to be done on a request basis, but it's certainly not going to work by me telling committees. I mean, I don't have that power, but they have that sort of power.
I find, going back to our training, when I was introducing myself to people, saying, I'm there as the community council representative. Some of them didn't even know there was a position, and they were pleased to think there was a voice here.
So I suppose if the desire is to do this, I would probably envisage just going out to the clerks to have something agendaed at the community to just get a feel for who would be interested in having someone come along.
I think you'd have, in fairness to all of them, just for us to make local arrangements to go and, would you mind if I came and sat in on your council meeting, would probably be a bit ad hoc and not very professional in some respects. What would be more appropriate probably would be something from yourself to say, this is what the Standards Committee
Yes.
are envisaging they would like to do.
Yes.
To all 33 councils, the town and county community councils, and saying, you know, that we would like to request attendance. Are you amenable to this, etc., etc. Please indicate yay or nay. Discuss it at your next meeting. It's to, at this stage, it is to inform standard committee members, and then maybe indicate to them in future we may then proceed to X, Y, and Z, so that they are quite clear about what the motive is behind the visit. Otherwise, it gets into one of those kind of, well, what are they doing?
Yeah.
Who are they? What are they? You know, what are they going to go and tell everyone else? And so, if you're very clear about it in terms of why we would want to do that.
Sheila, again.
I'm just thinking now, as you've mentioned that, would it be helpful then to say, I mean, we wouldn't expect Standards Committee members to go along to answer questions, but they could certainly, members of the council could get, you know, have some time, give you some questions to bring back for further information for themselves, make it a two-way thing.
Does that fit in as an observer?
I know if I was in a meeting and I didn't understand very much, I'd be really tempted to ask the person questions about the Standards Committee.
I mean, you could certainly ask questions about what the Standard Committee does, and you could answer those questions, but you couldn't get into, I'm guessing, not into the nitty-gritty of somebody, you know, where they wouldn't actually have recourse to Matt. I mean, I wouldn't, you know,
your
I could just say that.
dispensation question at the conference, but not many people knew about the processes rather than the individual cases. If you could come back and say, well, that council would like information on dispensation. Just a thought, make it two-way.
There's one other thing which is a weakness in the system as far as I've seen. I have always attended my 4 community councillors as a county councillor, because the information flow that comes from them back to me and then back here and the other way around is valuable. So many of my colleagues do not go to their community council or town council meetings, and I think that's a weakness in the whole system. We are paid. We receive a salary for being a county councillor, right? It's not a fortune, but it does, I think, promote me to go and visit my community councils, and I think we could encourage them as a committee for that stage to be taken, because they can glean a lot. They go to a meeting. We don't. I mean, I don't say a lot, but if you want to ask me a question at the meeting, you ask me.
Absolutely.
Peter.
I had a question that's just been answered.
Right, okay.
I was going to ask whether there was any system by which county councillors attended the community councils.
Well, it's community in town, because there's 43 of us, and as we've just heard, 34 councils. So some of them have got multi-representation. The towns, for instance, got 5, 6. You know, the 4 big towns have got the.
I know there are cases in which a county councillor is also a town or community council.
Yeah, where we overlap as well.
The link is natural, but there are other cases where that's not true and the link isn't there. I'm just asking, because I think if we were to go to observe as members of the Standards Committee, that seems almost premature if the community council itself has never seen a county councillor, and the questions they might have might be far more broad than just to the business that we do here.
Again, it worried me a little bit when Annette was telling us about complaints and praise, and yet it was not going through a community council. And it possibly could have been solved at community council level.
I think the majority of those, you know, it's rubbish collection and things like that.
Oh well, that's different, yeah.
Usually puddles or potholes.
Yeah.
Street
lights.
Yeah.
Just on Richard, you've got a unique viewpoint from the English side of things. What happens over there in terms of?
Well, first I was thinking about observation of town and community council meetings, and frequently you have dual-hatted councillors, especially on town councils. There's lots of them in Herefordshire, and yes, I would say frequently the county councillor attends their relevant parish council meetings, and so you've already got, if you wanted to do thinking about observation of what's going on, and you would expect actually, or I would expect, if there are developing or repeated behaviour issues or things going on at community council level, that might be the first contact you might get back to you might be the county councillor. So I just want to let you know there's something going on at one of my community councils, and this is what I think it is. And so you've got that routing straight away by someone who has more responsibility, great knowledge of the code, knows the officers here and everything. So that structure is there. And in fact, when I get complaints in Herefordshire about repeated behaviour at parish council meetings, it may involve clerk, bullying, harassment, those sort of things that's going on and on, I always ask for an opinion from the ward member, and invariably that is very helpful because they've been to lots of meetings, they've seen how things are developing, they understand the personalities, and whether this was a one-off heat of the moment, under provocation type thing, or whether actually there's something more serious. And so I think if you said, what's a good way to find out or keep up with what's going on and the town and community councils, it's through your existing county councillors who attend, because they've got the expertise, they're there, they're repeatable.
Thank you. Okay, where to take it from here then?
Well, I'm certainly happy to. I mean, if this is, I'm just to bound this. I think any attendance would need to be by the independent members, because I think councillors attending other councils is not a good idea. But I'm certainly happy to write out explaining that there is an interest from the Standards Committee in better understanding how community councils work and operate, and whether there's differences there. And would they be interested in having someone, or would they be able to accommodate someone to come and attend? And then kind of lean into here's what could come up. What will come of it is a better informed Standards Committee. What might fall out of it is the ability to share practice, building on the Clerks Council, and build a bit of a narrative about that. If that's what's desired, does that sound appropriate?
And can our minutes show that we appreciate the attendance of county councillors at community council meetings, and would encourage all county councillors to undertake this role, which is appreciated.
Just amongst the independent members, and is there a general sort of consensus of attending meetings, as an observer, particularly when some of the meetings could be 3 hours duration?
Sometimes they're not. Very exciting.
Because that's quite time consuming, really.
And the travelling.
Is a general feeling like, Richard, you live God knows how many miles away?
Well, I was a community councillor here in Crookhorny, and I was vice chairman, I was chairman, I still get the agendas and minutes, I talk to the councillors there, I attend committee meetings at Herefordshire, so I wouldn't really have an interest in attending community and town council meetings. And I think if there was an issue, my view is the first way in there would be through the relevant Monmouthshire County ward member. That's the thing. Not for me to go spend my time trucking around the county, spending 3 hours in a badly run, possibly, community council meeting, which I've seen a few, in my time. So I do have an understanding of the function and roles of community councils, and I keep up with that. So personally, I wouldn't have an interest in it.
Okay. I'll do it individually then. Richard, what's your view?
In principle, I actually think it's a good idea, but in principle, if the reason for doing it was to add value in some way, so it was to perhaps, so from my personal perspective, if it meant I was going to learn something that was going to be beneficial to me in doing this role, but also if there was potential to add value back into the relevant community council because you observed something or you realised there was stuff going on that perhaps the clerk needs to be made aware that wasn't acceptable from a code of conduct perspective and those kind of things. To me, I think in principle that's a great idea. But in reality, whether or not I would have the energy and time available is something I would like to reserve my position on, I think.
Okay, very tactful.
I
Brianne?
mean, I share Richard's view with this, is that I think there is, you have, if you're going to do it, there has to be added value for this committee as well as, you know, the community councils that are being observed. And I think there is, I mean, I'm gaining a sense, even just the conversations around this room, that there is such variability in how our, you know, community councils are functioning, town councils are functioning, that perhaps it does need a spotlight to look at. Well, shouldn't that be less? You know,
Yeah, just to continue to balance, I mean, how they function and how effective they are is not necessarily always tied to code of conduct, and we've got to be
yes,
quite
of course,
careful about that element.
Peter?
I was a town councillor for 5 years in a different county. I kind of miss it in some ways.
You like long evenings.
It's 33.
Well, the county I was referring to has over 70 town and community councils, and the one conclusion I did come to very quickly was that whilst the council I was sitting on was large enough to have a full-time clerk and a part-time deputy clerk, and then having some contact with other community councils in the area, realising that size was almost everything, and that if you've got a full-time clerk, you have a much better chance of being informed as a councillor about what's going on. If you have a clerk who's just a volunteer and really, in some cases, was not much more than a minute taker, there is no way that you could look to them for advice on issues like exemption, etc. I think it's a good idea. I think the results of it, in some senses, might be entirely predictable. You're going to find that the larger town councils with more resource and with a full-time clerk are simply better run than the small community councils that will struggle. And I have to say that I was a bit sorry in some senses that all that local government reform activity that went on, suggesting that there might be some merging of community councils and therefore a smaller number of larger councils at that tier, seems to have gone away for a while, and perhaps it's time for it to come back. We would be in a much better position to do this kind of work if there were 10 town or community councils in Monmouthshire rather than 33.
Yeah.
But I would be happy to join any operation that other people would support.
Irene?
Well, I think we've taken the right step, having the training, which was effective. And those that didn't come, they don't realise what they've missed. And I think this is then the role of the county council. If they could be encouraged to go along to community councils where they've not attended, that would plant the right seeds. I don't think there's any urgency for us to take drastic action and all go along thinking we're going to solve it. I think the answer already exists.
Matt, you mentioned that Cardiff Standards Committee, I appreciate it's a city, it's huge, Monmouthshire isn't, but it does have a standards committee that does do observation visits.
I think so.
Can we get hold of their guidance on how they do it and why they do it? And
yes.
Would that be important?
I mean, this came of a conversation with my opposite member there, Savina, and I think I certainly think she gets her clerks together kind of annually, but then again, for argument's seven, it's that bit easier. And I think part of it is that they sometimes go out. So I'll certainly ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, it might inform us about, you know, what someone else, why reinvent the wheel.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
happy to do that.
Obviously, scale is different, but the fundamental principles will be the same.
As a concept, this has been on the agenda now for a number of different meetings. We've sort of been kicking this about. So I think the idea has got merit, I think, and off the back of the initiative that you've done with the conference, it was obviously very well received. So I think as long as we don't attempt to get around all 33, but maybe cherry pick, and we decide that we're going to look specifically at some things for our own educational purposes, because it gets us away from these desks and out into our communities, just to see for ourselves what's going on, think that's got to be a good thing. So it feels like it might be the next step off the back of that initiative, having the clerks conference, that we do something proactive like that ourselves. So they came to us, so we go to them, but we maybe, you know, just pick one each. We don't try and get around 4 each or anything like that.
And we could choose, I mean, you know, who attended for just a kind of, you know, the initial phase. We could choose to go and visit those quarter that came to us, so that 3/4, sorry, misheard. You know, we could choose some from those 3/4, and then the other quarter might think we're missing out here.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've left it that you're going to talk to Cardiff about their observations, could chat Democratic Services about costs and things, and then we'll leave it to the next meeting. We'll think about it, whether we've got the time to devote to something like that. I think, first of all, thank you, Aaron, for going through that. I think, you know, the observation side of it is definitely of value. There's no doubt there. And just how we go about doing that. But I think the also Richard's idea, you know, we select 1 or 2 a year, preferably those that aren't 3 hours long, and go for them. Just I think just the attendance of someone from the Standards Committee will make people aware, you know, what on earth are they doing here? What should we be doing things differently?
Might make the meeting shorter as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Focus the mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Ram. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is, surprisingly, minutes of the previous meeting. Just get this up on my screen. Okay, the first thing I'd say is that I was definitely here at the last meeting, and I think people are telling me something here. Time to go.
No.
Doing a Boris on me. Okay, so if you could add my name to those present, please.
Yeah, and me as well, please.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you missed off the phone.
But you haven't been missed off twice, Richard. Okay, on page 1 then, are there any issues arising from that? Yeah.
In fact, go back to I mean, whether it's the format I'm reading this on, but just looking at who was present, it appears that all of us have become county councillors, because it's...
Oh, on the earlier pages, yeah, I noticed that.
Because it's county councillors : and then our list of names. So
Yeah.
It appears we've all been changed status.
Draw a salary now.
This is why Nick hasn't turned up today, isn't it?
That may need, well, it should be corrected, not may.
Yeah, I think that was on like the separate sheet of the agenda, wasn't it? Okay, thank you. So page 1, we're through. Page 2. And page 3. No. Okay, if we can accept those minutes as being a true record. In terms of matters arising from the minutes, I'd just like to go to item number 7 on those ones, dispensation request discussion. I think in terms of the example that I put before the committee last time, I did try to get an argument going on it, but you were all too good. You obviously read through it, knew what was in there. One of the interesting points, the dispensation I put before you was a sort of a tweaked one that this committee had received several years ago. And we came to exactly the same conclusion, that the person involved, there was just too close. There was personal, prejudicial and pecuniary interests. And we said that you should, if you want to speak, go along to the meeting and as a member of the public. And they actually did that. They went along, but what I hadn't realised was that in some of the town and community council meetings, there is only a set amount of time given to enable members of the public to speak. I don't know if that's
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
It's up to the discussion of the chair, and
Okay.
it's 20 minutes.
Yeah, well, this applicant for the dispensation had gone along to the meeting, and he was effectively shut out of saying what he wanted to say. So he had come back to the monitoring office to say that fine, the standards committee had told him that he couldn't have a dispensation, but he could say what he wanted to at the meeting, but he couldn't, because when he went along, he didn't get that opportunity. So it is a solution, but it's not always an effective solution.
15 minutes, yeah.
I don't know if is that written into your constitutions, this sort of
Yeah.
20 minutes, 15 minutes?
It's just Matt, it's not the one we had to deal with, is it?
It's a long time ago, this
It's not the one we
particular.
had to interview before our council meeting. That person.
Whatever the example that was taken from here, that I have no involvement with it.
Okay, no. It must have been 8 years ago, something like that. So it's a while ago. Yeah, so it is, if that's the case, that 20 minutes and you shut off.
You should, yeah, and it's, as I say, it's up to the discussion of the chair. If there's obviously, if it's a big issue, you just can't shut it off because you get accused for all things. But you let them speak, and if you can reply, you will, or you can say, well, I can't give you that answer at the moment, but we'll get it and come back to you.
The time is made clear to the person.
Yes.
before they start.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. It was also noted in the minutes that we discussed the nature of the form, and I must admit, for that particular example, it's the first time I've ever filled one of those forms in, and they are terrible, absolutely terrible to understand what the meaning of the dispensation you're trying to seek. So it was agreed that the format of the form should be amended and updated. I notice it's now on the website. Also, when we had this discussion, Richard later came back with reminding us that in 2016 there was an amendment to the dispensation regulations, adding a separate sentence to the final paragraph there. So we agreed the form should be amended and updated. In terms of what we were looking at, I don't think that's been taken forward at all, as it is still exactly the same form. And we're looking at the word disability and the meaning of the word disability in terms of the dispensation regulations. I think it's more of a legal term, disability, in terms of the physical side of things. Has that gone anywhere?
No, I don't recall the disability. I remember the.
So is there an action on that to produce a revised form?
I was going to say, whose job is it to revise the form?
in
We'll
term-
work that out first.
Yeah, well, we had the discussion, and at the end of it, Nicola's noted it was agreed that the format of the form should be amended and updated.
But nobody actioned to do so.
So you just have to work
Absolutely.
by Matt, isn't it, at the end?
Everything falls on Matt at the end of it.
Looks like your job then, Matt.
Yes.
But it's really what we want in terms of updating and amendments, because the regulations are the regulations. There's not a lot we can do about them.
No.
And the Ombudsman, to his credit, has tried to simplify them so that you can understand them. But even reading through them, I don't know, have a go. Fill in that dispensation form online and just see what you make of it. It's not easy, and which is when we've had dispensations in the past, 90% of it has been empty. They just put their names in, a quick idea of what it is they want, and then it comes before us.
Yes, that's right. It was linked to the question about validation, a bit like plan applications. There's a strict process for plan applications where if you haven't got certain information, you don't get through the door. Whereas the danger at the moment is dispensation requests can come in here and end up on agenda when there's clearly stuff missing that could have been stopped before it got to the committee, and that was part of the discussion about making the form much clearer. You must complete this section, etc. Those sort of things. So tightening it up a bit.
So really, Other than that, there's nothing to add to that, is there?
Got it.
Okay, right. Thank you. If we move on to item number 8, which over to you, Matt, on that, in terms of exclusions.
Can we bin the streaming, please?